What we recognize in this series is that sin isn't a comfortable or fun or exciting thing to talk about, but it absolutely needs our attention. In this series, we're looking at different ways we can recognize how sin works, not just so that we can overcome it, but so that we can recognize the price it cost Jesus. Today, as we wrap up this series, we're going to look at one final sin and its consequences, and today we're looking at the anatomy of complaining. Now, when you hear the topic that we're going to be talking about, the sin of complaining, you might have the same question I had when I looked at the series plans and saw that for week 4, the final thing I'd be talking about is complaining. Like, aren't there more serious sins we could address? Like, shouldn't we talk about murder? Something like that. But the more I dug into it, the more I realized this is such a subtle but serious thing that I believe affects everybody in different ways. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, I think it's important to recognize that since today we're talking about sin and we're equating it with complaining, we should be careful to define what we mean by complaining. And the first disclaimer is that not all complaining is the same. There's 2 general categories I'll work with today, and we'll just go through these quickly so that we can focus on what we're focusing on. The first category is the horizontal preferences. Things like the weather. Anyone complain about the weather last month? Yeah. Is it spring or is it not spring? Like, what's going on? We complain about traffic or long lines. Like, do anyone else just always pick the wrong line at the grocery store? I think it's the shortest, but then I see other people just zipping by and the other one, I complain. We complain about sports. Man, why did the head coach do that? Why did the referee make that call? Like, we complain about those things. Those are things I would refer to as horizontal, like they're earthly things. They're not really spiritual issues, they're just inconveniences. And sometimes we just like to talk about things that don't go our way. We're not talking about that today. It's okay to complain about the weather. Although I would suggest if you're meeting with your group this week, you could talk about where does everyday complaining, when does that turn into sin? Like, it could do that. But we're not talking about those everyday types of things today. Today we're specifically talking about complaining against God or complaining about God. Now, maybe on your way here today, maybe some of you complained, I can't believe there's construction already. But I doubt any of you said, I can't believe God. Like, it's not something you normally lead with, right? Like, I can't believe God said this. Can't believe God did that. It's not like we overtly complain about God. What we tend to do is something much more subtle, but just as serious. And I'll share it with a personal example of something I experienced recently on a human level. So in our house, I'm usually the one who makes dinner. And about a month ago, we tried a new recipe. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was work. I had to figure out how to make it, all this stuff. And so it took some time, took some effort. And I got everything ready, and we sat down at the table, and we ate. And then one of my kids, who shall remain nameless, said this, this dinner is mid. And I dropped my fork. Mid. Now, for those of you who don't have middle schoolers, here's some subtitles to help you understand. Basically, they said, I don't care for this much. And part of me was like, you don't care for this much. Well, maybe you'll make dinner tomorrow. Maybe you can buy the groceries. You're welcome for sustaining you through your teenage years where you eat everything in this house. Part of me was like, you want to complain? I'll give you something to complain about. What we all know is that a subtle complaint about the food is an indirect complaint against the chef. How many times do I do that with God? Maybe there's a time where I complain or you complain about a personal weakness. I just wish I was better at this. They're so good at it. I wish I was more like them. I wish I could do this. And all the while, God from heaven is saying, but I laid before you this weakness so that you can depend on my strength. Maybe you complain about the circumstances of life, how something isn't fair. And so you have these complaints that are about all the things happening in your life, and this isn't fair, I can't believe that happened, and how's this gonna work out? And all the while, God is saying, I put these there so you would trust me. Maybe in your life, there's someone in your family, someone in your life that is just really difficult, and you complain about them. Maybe it's a sibling. Maybe it's a neighbor. But you complain about them, you say, oh, they did this, they did that, I can't believe they did this again. And all the while, God in heaven is saying, but I put them there to shape you into who I want you to be. We don't usually complain about God directly. A lot of times it's more subtle, but just as serious. And one thing to think about this week is, number one, some complaints about earthly life are unknowingly aimed at heaven. I think we could just wrap up the sermon right there and all right, we all got some homework to do. Let's think about the things we're really complaining about. Are they actually subtle complaints about God? About the circumstances he's given to me? About the weaknesses he's allowed, about the people that he has placed for a purpose. A lot of times, the complaints about earthly life are unknowingly aimed at heaven. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to see what God does when that happens. Sometimes your complaints might knowingly be aimed at heaven. Sometimes it's subtle, but just as serious. But what we're going to do today is see how God guides us to, first of all, recognize when this is happening, and then how he addresses complainers. And the way we're going to do this is by looking at the account of the Exodus from Egypt. There's a book of the Bible called Exodus, and it's all about the Israelite nation who was enslaved in Egypt is finally getting freed from it. And it details the account of how God sent a deliverer named Moses, who was, by the way, full of weakness, and he couldn't speak well, but God used that for a purpose. God used Moses to send a series of plagues on Egypt, and finally it was the 10th plague, the plague of the firstborn, where Pharaoh, king of Egypt, finally said, I know these Israelites are my slaves, and they're supporting our economy. But what God is doing to us is too painful. These plagues, we can't stand them anymore. And so as Pharaoh, king of Egypt, witnesses an entire land, an entire country of the firstborn of each household dying, he breaks. That very night, as this plague was hitting, during the night, like an instinctual reaction, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, the leaders of the Israelites, and he said, up, leave my people, you and the Israelites, go worship the Lord as you have requested. And at that, he basically dismantled his entire economy. All the free slave labor was being sent out of the country, and it was gonna have a big cost. But he didn't care, because in that moment, it was too costly to hold on to them. And so what follows is what happens right after this happens. We get into Exodus chapters 13 and 14, where we see complaining come up. First, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that way was shorter. God might not send you on the shortest path through life because there's a reason to it. For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert toward the Red Sea. This wandering, inefficient, stopping at every pit stop kind of route where they were being slow and tedious and not getting to where they wanted to be. And maybe you've been there. You've been like, God, where are we going here? What's going on? But God had a purpose. If they had faced war, they would have given up and said, we just want to go back. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp. I'm going to murder these words, pronunciation. I'm not sure how to pronounce them. Encamp near Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal Zephon. Now, Those words, the places, they probably don't sound familiar to you. And the good news is they don't sound familiar to anybody. Today, like scholars say, we don't know exactly where these places were. But what we can draw from this is that God gave them 5 points of location to zero in on the exact coordinates where he wanted them to be. By this place and that place, across from here, by next to this place, and then by the sea. This is exact, like he basically put a giant X on the map and said, stand here. This is where I want you. And it didn't make sense. But here's where we get into Exodus chapter 14, where God says, Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. They have no idea where they're going. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, God said, and he will pursue them. Now you see all different parts of this plan are coming together. Like God is having them take this weird route. He's giving them a weird place to go. And God says, the reason I'm doing that is because this is what's going to happen next. And I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. He's going to pursue you. And you might think, and that's a good thing? If he knows Pharaoh will pursue them, why not send them on the quickest route out? Why not take the highway and make a beeline for the border? Why wander? Why stand here? The reality is that Moses and the Israelites did not know. They could not see what God could see. They were simply given directions. As we talked about last week, they were given this voice from God, directions from God, and they were told to trust. And before we see how they reacted to that, I want to ask you the question about the last time you had a complaint that might have been about God or against God. Sometimes we complain knowing only such a small part of the picture. We complain about the weather. It's raining again. But maybe God is answering the prayers of hundreds of farmers who depend on that same rain. We complain about circumstances in life, not knowing that maybe the unfortunate, unfavorable circumstance for us is actually a blessing for many people around us. We don't see how the conflict, the strife, the bad things are actually growing us into who we need to be because God sees a war coming that we don't even know yet. The Israelites couldn't see what God can see, and neither can we. And so the next time you feel like complaining, here's a question to ask. How much of the picture can you actually see? Be honest with yourself. How much of the picture can I actually see? Maybe if it's a person, maybe I see their outward behavior, but I don't know what's going on in their heart. Maybe if it's a circumstance, you say, oh, this is bad for me, but I don't know how this is having a ripple effect in dozens or hundreds or thousands of lives around me. Maybe if we just pause and we're honest that we can't see what God can see, it would limit our complaints to zero. God knew what was ahead for the Israelites, and so he planned accordingly, and he gave them directions for exactly where to go and where to stand. And sometimes God will give you directions about where to go or where to stand or what to take a stand on. And you'll say, that doesn't make sense. I see a different way, a shorter way. But the question is, will you trust what God shows? For the short term, the Israelites did. Exodus 14:4 says, God says, I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And so the Israelites did exactly what he said. They wandered where he wanted them to wander, and they stood right where he wanted them to stand. And now the interesting part of this account is we shift focus. We're not looking at things from the Israelites' perspective anymore, but now the camera pans over to the Egyptians and what's happening for them. And it's real interesting to see their perspective on things. It says, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds. I'm sure this was so hard for them to fathom because the Israelites, when they were freed, I'm sure they said, oh, good, God's favor is on us. But then something changed. And they said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their service. Our economy is in ruins. And so he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. They were going to pursue these Israelites, and the Israelites had no idea what was chasing them. But thankfully, God could see this, and thankfully, God had already taken them where they needed to be. The next verse explains more about what Pharaoh did to get his army ready. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. This was a massive mobilization. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. That hardening of the heart is a hard thing to make sense of. But what we know is that Pharaoh persistently disobeyed God. And throughout the course of 10 plagues on Egypt, Pharaoh went back and forth so many times telling the Israelites, okay, you can go, just kidding. Oh, you can go, just kidding. He was constantly against God. And so now at this point, God says, your time is done. Pharaoh, you will serve a purpose for me, but not in the way you think. And so God hardened his heart so that Pharaoh would pursue the Israelites. But things would end for God's glory. It goes on. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and all the chariots, horsemen and troops, they pursued the Israelites and they overtook them. In other words, they caught up. And as they camped near the sea, by the sea, near Pi Hahiroth, opposite Baal Zephon, right where God told them to be. Now, in just a moment, we'll look at this from the perspective of the Israelites, how hard this must have been for them. But first, let's look at this from the perspective of the Egyptians. In one word, this military campaign was easy. These people could have sprinted for the border, but instead they wandered the long way. They could have strategically placed themselves in a place where they could defend themselves, but instead they're trapped against a sea. And now that all the chariots and army of Egypt is upon them, it's like, are they even trying? This is easy. And perhaps Pharaoh was thinking the favor of the gods of Egypt were upon him because there was no resistance to what they were experiencing. In other words, there was no complaints from Pharaoh. Things were great. But what we need to be careful of is not to equate a lack of resistance with the favor of God. Lack of resistance in your life doesn't necessarily mean God is favoring the path you have chosen to take. Because in this case, an easy path was actually a path to God's judgment, not his favor. So in the realm of complaining, we should be aware that what's most important isn't the kind of path God has put before us, but rather where we will go. Because as remember from verse 4, God said, I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. Like we talked about last week, our purpose is not about us, it's about God. And if we have a different purpose, God will still make his glory be known through us one way or another. In other words, a path of resistance with no resistance is not always a sign of God's favor. Sometimes it's a sign of God's judgment. And so the next time maybe you're looking to complain, or maybe you're thinking, I've got nothing to complain about, this must be a good sign. What we need to focus on is not the circumstance of your life, but rather, number 3, we need to ask the question, are you seeking your good or God's glory? If you're seeking your good, you might have an easy, unhindered path to find it, to find whatever it is you're trying to look for. If you're seeking God's glory, the path might be difficult. He might tell you to stand where you'd prefer to not stand. So don't equate the ease of the path with the favor of God. Rather, ask yourself, are you seeking your good or God's glory? And then comes the big part, where we shift back to the perspective of the Israelites. So we've seen Egypt march out and they've overtaken the Israelites. They're right there, they're stuck. And now we see things from the perspective of the Israelites. So as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up and there were the Egyptians. The way the Hebrew is communicated, the way it's written, it's trying to put you in the shoes of the Israelites. They look up and there they are, marching after them. The Israelites were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. Cried out doesn't mean they reverently got down on their hands and knees and started praying to God. That Hebrew word for cried out means they were panicked and they were protesting. It was a panicked protest. And I think we've all felt that before, right? Like maybe you were doing what someone else told you to do. You took the directions they told you to take, or you stood where they told you to stand, and now things are going wrong. Wait, you told me to be here. What's going on? There's panic, there's protest. And it's interesting because the way their protest came out was not through some prayer to God, but through his spokesman, Moses. The people said to Moses, with a lot of sarcasm and a lot of anger, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you while we were still back there, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Complaining. And it wasn't subtle complaining. It was directly against God and his plan. Yet in the moment of their complaining, they reveal something so obvious that unfortunately I miss when I'm the one complaining. The three key words are, they said, it would have been better for us. Isn't that the heart of every complaint? Would have been better if we wouldn't have done this. Would have been better if we didn't drive here. It'd be better if this wasn't so much work for me. Would have been better for me, better for me. And those three words, better for us, they reveal three things that the Israelites were lacking. Better for us revealed a lack of wisdom. They didn't really see, they didn't really know what was going on. They misinterpreted the events to think that now they were trapped, and now there was no hope, and now they were dead. They had no wisdom. They lacked wisdom. Sometimes that can happen with us. We complain because we lack wisdom. Another thing they lacked was direction. They didn't understand how the events that led them here were actually a setup to their deliverance. They didn't know that this was the only way for God to set them up to truly free them from Egypt so that they wouldn't go back. They lacked direction, not knowing where God was taking them. And sometimes our complaining isn't because we're going where we don't want to be. It's because we don't know the direction. But ultimately, here's the big thing that this all boils down to. Every complaint in some way, and especially the complaint of the Israelites, revealed a lack of trust. God, your plans are no good. God, we don't trust you can get us through this. God, you told us to stand here, and that was a bad call. That was the wrong move to make. We don't trust you anymore. We should have stayed there. We would have been better off without you. This was the crescendo of complaining that will unfortunately repeat itself in future cycles over the course of decades. But for you and for me, we need to look at what they did and apply it to ourselves. So easy for us to look at them and say, well, you're better for us thing. Like you are lacking some things, many things, wisdom, direction, trust. But the next time you are prompted to complain, I might ask you, or I should ask myself when I'm prompted to complain, the question to wrestle with is, what do our complaints reveal we're missing? Maybe it's I don't see everything God can see. I lack wisdom. Maybe it's I don't see God's big picture plan. I don't know the direction. But isn't it true that at the heart of every complaint, there's a lack of trust? So, if you've ever been the recipient of a complaint because your food wasn't quite right, if you've ever been told something you did was mid, Maybe your conclusion was, then you do it next time. When we complain against God, his response should be, oh, you don't like my way, then you have your way. You don't like my circumstances? Try to create your own. You don't like my direction? Have at it. He should have let them do whatever they wanted. And so when Moses responded to them after hearing their complaint, he could have said, God Almighty has judged you. But instead, Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm. Stand where God told you to stand. And you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today will never see you again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Stand where he told you to stand, and you will see deliverance. That's what God said to complainers like the Israelites and to me. And the miracle that they're about to see, you can read about it this week in Exodus chapter 14 if you want. The miracle they're about to see is a miracle that was defied explanation. God told Moses, take your staff, strike the water, and see what happens. And so Moses took his staff, he struck the water, and God parted the water. He made this path, this way that was previously closed off so that the Israelites could walk through on dry ground. And when the Egyptians pursued them, the water crashed around them. God parted the water. He told them, just stand here, just be still, just do what I ask, and watch for my deliverance. And there's one other person that God told that to. Centuries later, God told him, stand here. Do exactly what I ask. Go up to the dead end and trust me. But for that person, the waters were not parted. It was the Son of God, and the night before he would face his death on a cross, he was on his hands and knees in the Garden of Gethsemane saying, Father, this cup you have placed before me, this cup of suffering and death, I don't want it. I would rather pursue salvation a different way, but not my will, your will be done. This unfair cup of wrath and punishment that was deserved to be given to sinners was being placed before him, yet he did not complain. Father, not my will, but yours be done. For Jesus, the waters were not parted. For Jesus, death came, and the punishment for sin was placed on him. Isaiah, hundreds of years before this, prophesied what this would be like. He, the Messiah, the King, was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He did not complain. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. The one who had every right to complain and protest and panic instead kneeled before his Father and said, your will be done. And because the waters weren't parted for him, that's what made them parted for you. And as one of the eyewitnesses, as Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, as he saw this whole thing take place, Jesus, knowing his death was coming and yet not complaining about it and pursuing it, Peter, as he thought about Isaiah's words, he put it this way. He said, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he did what we could never do. He trusted. Or he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He said, Father, your will be done. How incredible that the one who could have complained refused. Because though what he faced was unjust and unfair, he knew it was the only way to strike the water and open it for you. And so in love, He laid down his life on that cross and absorbed the punishment of every sin. God the Father vented his anger at all of our complaining onto his own Son so that he would spare you and me from it. Wow. What a week to be mindful of how petty our complaining can be, and sometimes even the subtle complaining. We're not even aware of it, but it's unknowingly directed at heaven itself. What God does to complainers is he says, do not be afraid, for I will make a way for you. So maybe this week our homework is just to be aware of how maybe our subtle complaining is actually directed at heaven itself and what that actually means about our trust in God. And when you find yourself complaining like I do, I could have told you all sorts of stories today. When you find yourself complaining like I do, maybe that's a cue for us, not just to be mindful of it, but to say, God, thank you that Jesus was not like me. And if you want, I have a short prayer that you can use this week. I'll keep it on the screen for a little bit so you can either write it down or take a screenshot or watch the live stream and do a screenshot later. But I think this is a powerful prayer to use when faced with a heart of complaint. You say, God, help me see things as you see them. I can't see the plan, but would you help me see that you have one? I can't see the ultimate direction for everything in my life, but would you show me what I need to see? Would you help me see people the way you see them and see circumstances the way that you do? Help me see things as you see them. And here's the important part. And help me trust you when I can't. It's going to be things on this side of heaven we'll never understand. Things that seem bad and we want to complain about it. But be aware, every complaint is an invitation to distrust God. So let's respond with this prayer this week. Help me see things as you see them. Help me trust you when I can't. And thank you for sending me Jesus, who without complaint endured my sin for me. Let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, man, there's so many different circumstances in life where we would all stand convicted because we tend to complain about things that don't go our way, not recognizing that they're actually your way. You can take things that don't seem good to us and you can work them out for good. So often we complain. It'd be better for us, we say, if we could have things the way they were. Better for us if things would be different. Your anger should be so fierce, and it was. But today we thank you that your anger was vented onto Jesus instead of us. What an amazing act of sacrifice that he would, without complaint, take this unfair verdict of guilty and pay the price for it. Help us be mindful this week. Help us do an audit this week of the ways that we overtly or even subtly complain. Help us to simply say these words, Father, help me see things as you see them, and help me trust you when I can. Amen. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look on you with favor and give you peace.